War has been a constant in human history. It's shaped empires, toppled kingdoms, and decided the fate of entire civilizations. But war isn't just about brute force, it's about strategy, it's about outsmarting your enemy. Ancient military commanders knew this well. They were the chess masters of their time, moving troops like pieces on a grand, bloody board. These ancient strategies weren't just about who had the biggest army, they were about using what you had in the smartest way possible. Think about it. You're a general with 10,000 men. Your enemy has 20,000. How do you win? That's where strategy comes in. It's about positioning, timing, and sometimes plain old trickery. These ancient tactics weren't just effective then. Many of them are still used today in one form or another. The strategies we're going to talk about span continents and centuries, from the disciplined formations of the Greeks to the mobile cavalry of the Mongols. Each civilization brought something unique to the battlefield, and each left its mark on military history. So let's step back in time and explore the brilliant, sometimes brutal world of ancient military strategy. Picture this, you're on an ancient battlefield. In front of you is a wall, not of stone but of men. Shields locked together, spears pointing forward. This is the Greek phalanx. It's one of the most famous military formations in history, and for good reason. The phalanx was a game changer in ancient warfare. It turned ordinary citizen soldiers into an unstoppable force. The basic idea of the phalanx is simple. Men stand close together, shields overlapping. They form a human wall. In front of this wall are long spears called sarissas. These spears were so long that the first 5 rows of men could point their spears at the enemy. Imagine facing that. You'd see nothing but a bristling wall of spear points. The phalanx was primarily a defensive formation, but it could also be used to push into enemy lines, like a massive battering ram of flesh and bronze. The strength of the phalanx was in its unity. Each man protected not just himself, but the man next to him. Your shield covered half of your body and half of your neighbors. This created an incredibly strong defensive position. The phalanx dominated ancient battlefields for centuries. If the Greek phalanx was a hammer, the Roman legion was a Swiss army knife. The Romans took military organization to a whole new level. Their legions were marvels of discipline, training, and tactical flexibility. A Roman legion typically consisted of about 5,000 men, divided into smaller units called cohorts and centuries. This structure allowed for incredible versatility on the battlefield. The basic fighting unit of the legion was the maniple. Think of it as a mini phalanx, but more flexible. Maniples could fight in tight formation or spread out as needed. They could even operate independently, if required. This gave Roman commanders a lot of options. They could adapt their tactics on the fly, responding to changing battlefield conditions. The Romans are famous for their testudo or tortoise formation. In this formation, soldiers would lock their shields together, forming a protective shell. It was incredibly effective against missile weapons. The Romans also perfected the art of siege warfare. They built massive siege engines and developed sophisticated tactics for taking fortified positions. This adaptability, combined with iron discipline, made the Roman legions the dominant military force in the ancient world for centuries. Walls have always been humanity's go-to defense. They're simple, effective, and they've been around since we first started building cities. But where there are walls, there are people trying to break them down. This is where siege warfare comes in. It's a type of warfare that's as much about patience and engineering as it is about fighting. The basic idea of a siege is simple. You surround a fortified position and try to force the defenders to surrender. But the execution, that's where things get complicated. Early siege tactics often involved simply waiting out the defenders, cut off their supplies, and eventually they'll have to give up or starve. But this could take months or even years. And the besieging army had to feed itself too. So military commanders started getting creative. One of the most famous siege weapons was the trebuchet. Think of it as a giant slingshot. It could hurl massive stones at city walls, gradually weakening them. The Romans perfected the use of siege towers. These were massive wooden structures on wheels. They could be rolled up to city walls, allowing attackers to climb over. And let's not forget about tunneling. Digging under city walls was a common tactic. If you couldn't go over, why not go under? Siege warfare might seem like ancient history, but its principles are still relevant today in urban warfare tactics. Section 5. Cavalry charges, the thundering hooves of war. There's something primal about the sound of galloping horses. Now imagine that sound multiplied by hundreds, even thousands. That's the sound of a cavalry charge. It's a sound that struck fear into the hearts of ancient soldiers. Cavalry was a game changer on ancient battlefields. It added speed and shock value to armies that had previously relied mainly on infantry. The use of cavalry in warfare dates back to around 900 BCE, but it really came into its own with the invention of the stirrup. The stirrup gave riders more stability. They could now deliver powerful blows with lances without falling off their horses. This made cavalry charges incredibly effective. A well-timed cavalry charge could break enemy formations, create chaos, and turn the tide of battle. One of the most famous cavalry forces in ancient history was the companions of Alexander the Great. These were elite horsemen who played a crucial role in Alexander's conquests. Their tactics involved a wedge formation. The point of the wedge would smash into enemy lines, creating a gap. The rest of the cavalry would then pour through this gap, spreading out to wreak havoc. Section 6. Naval warfare, battles on the high seas. The sea has always been a frontier of human conflict. Naval warfare in ancient times was a unique challenge. It combined the need for seafaring skills with military strategy. Early naval battles were often just land battles fought on ships. Vessels would ram each other and then soldiers would board and fight hand-to-hand. But as ship design evolved, so did naval tactics. One of the most famous naval battles in ancient history was the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE. This battle pitted the Greek fleet against the much larger Persian fleet. The Greeks used their knowledge of local waters to their advantage. They lured the Persian ships into a narrow strait. There, the Persians couldn't use their superior numbers effectively. The more maneuverable Greek ships were able to outfight the Persians, winning a crucial victory. Naval warfare wasn't just about battles, though. Control of the seas meant control of trade routes. In many ways, naval power was a key factor in the rise and fall of ancient empires. Section 7. Guerrilla tactics, the art of surprise. Not all ancient warfare was about big armies clashing on open fields. Sometimes the most effective tactics were those that avoided direct confrontation. Enter guerrilla warfare. The term guerrilla wasn't used until much later in history, but the tactics, they're as old as warfare itself. Guerrilla tactics are all about using surprise, mobility, and the terrain to your advantage. One of the earliest recorded uses of guerrilla tactics was by Judas Maccabeus in 167 BCE. He led a Jewish revolt against the Seleucid Empire. Outnumbered and outgunned, Judas used hit-and-run tactics. He would strike at isolated enemy units, then melt away into the countryside before reinforcements could arrive. These tactics allowed a small force to take on a much larger army. Guerrilla tactics weren't just for the underdogs, though. Even large empires used them when the situation called for it. The Parthians, for example, were masters of the feigned retreat. These ancient strategies laid the groundwork for later guerrilla movements throughout history. Section 8. Psychological warfare, breaking the enemy's will. War isn't just about physical combat, it's also a battle of wills. Ancient military leaders understood this well. They knew that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to break their spirit. This is where psychological warfare comes in. It's about using fear, intimidation, and deception to gain an advantage. And it's been a part of warfare since the earliest conflicts. One of the masters of psychological warfare was Genghis Khan. The Mongol leader used fear as a weapon. He would offer cities a choice: surrender or face total destruction. Many cities surrendered without a fight, terrified by the Mongols' reputation. Those that resisted often faced brutal consequences. This created a cycle of fear that preceded the Mongol army. Cities would hear of the fate of those who resisted and choose to surrender instead. The ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu wrote extensively about psychological warfare. In his book, The Art of War, he said, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." These ancient techniques of psychological warfare laid the groundwork for modern propaganda and information warfare. Section 9. Logistics and supply lines, the unsung heroes. We often think of ancient warfare in terms of brave warriors and clever generals, but behind every successful army was a complex system of logistics. Feeding, equipping, and moving thousands of soldiers was a massive challenge, and it often determined the outcome of wars as much as any battle. The great military leaders of the ancient world understood this well. Alexander the Great was a master of logistics. His conquests took him thousands of miles from Macedonia. Keeping his army supplied over such vast distances was a monumental task. He solved this in part by living off the land. His army would forage for food as they marched, but he also established supply depots along his route. These ensured a steady flow of provisions and reinforcements. Without this logistical backbone, his conquests would have been impossible. The Romans took military logistics to new heights. They built an extensive network of roads across their empire.